Banner review. So the first half of the banners just got released, and for the character banner we do have Sucrose, Barbara, and an Ororon rates up. For the weapon banner, we have Chasca's weapon, the Astral Vulture Crimson's Plumage, that's a very long name, Lyney's weapon, the First Great Magic, and I believe we do have a few of the other weapons. I think it's a new Chasca All-Star Gacha weapon, the new Catalyst, the Flute, Favonius, and the Belt. So if you want to know my thoughts for Chasca and Lyney, go check out this video, link is down in the description below. But overall, my general thoughts about Chasca is that she's probably going to be good, but I'm not really going to make an educated assumption before she actually comes out in about 2 days after this video. And for Lyney, he's generally pretty good if you do have his 5-star weapon or some other 5-star weapon options, because a lot of his damage is very much front-loaded, which makes him one of the more popular characters for speedrunning. But that's if you don't really mind playing the charge attack build playstyle, which is a bit less forgiving compared to someone like Ganyu. Now, for the 4-star units, we'll start off with Sucrose. So Sucrose was the very original Anemo support before we had the likes of Kazuha in version 1.6. And even up until this day, the only competition that she really has is really just Kazuha and I guess Hazel, but that's a little bit of a stretch for that end. In terms of what she adds to your account, she can use the Viridescent Veneer set similar to Kazuha to help buff your PHEC DPS based teams. She has a lot of other fancy teams like Sucrose National or even Sucrose Taser, which is Electro Charge, and her ability to interact with Goba created this terminology called Goba Swirl, which allows you to basically swirl Pyro and Hydro in certain teams. Now, if you were to look at her constellations, the most notable one is generally C1, to a certain extent Constellation 4 and C6. So her elemental skill only has a default of 1 charge, and if you get C1, you can gain up to 3 uses of her elemental skill if you're pairing it up with something like the Sacrificial Fragments. C2 is nice, basically your burst lasts 2 seconds longer, but generally your burst is not going to be too helpful, and the grouping is not comparable to something like Kazuha's hold skill. And then C3 and C5 is just a few levels, it's very minimal. C4 is actually kind of useful because it reduces the cooldown of your skill between a random range of 1 to 7 seconds for every 7 normal or charge attack hits she scores. This constellation is particularly useful if you're running an on-field Sucrose in teams like Sucrose National or certain like Sucrose Aggravate teams with Fischl and Beta, or even Sucrose Taser. And of course, C6 makes her comparable in buffing to the likes of Kazuha. When her burst absorbs any of the 4 elements, everyone will gain the 20% elemental damage bonus for that element. This is a little bit tricky to set up and it might screw up in reactions, so most of the time C6 is not really that useful in a lot of situations, so most notable C1 is a good stopping point. For the next character, we have Barbara. So Barbara has her own niche uses while not being that good since her Hydro application is very weak. Her healing is probably one of the more potent ones out there, aside from the likes of Shen Yun and her sister Jean. She is somewhat best in slot or kind of usable in a team like Nilo Bloom, and I've tried it before for the FTP variant, it is actually quite decent. Also, she can be used in Furina teams if you were to run Mono Hydro or you don't have any other healers to build up your Furina stacks. Now, her constellations, most of them don't really matter too much. C2 I think is pretty nice. C1 is a little bit of an energy thing, but 1 energy every 10 seconds for a burst that costs 80 is not really that impactful. C2 decreases the cooldown of a skill, which allows you to cast it more often, and your active character gains Hydro bonus, so if you run like Mono Hydro, or you run like any Hydro DPS based teams, this is quite useful. And then of course, C3 and C5 are pretty nice to give a bit of boost for her healing. C4 gives her like a flat energy every time her charge attack lands. It's very minor unless you run like a Vape DPS Barbara or whatnot. C6 is similar to Chi-Chi, where every time someone in your team dies, they will have a chance to get fully revived to full health with 0 energy, and this effect can occur once every 15 minutes. Of course, Barbara has to be in the party, but not on field. Now, Barbara does have some uses here and there. I think Nilo Bloom is still the most notable one. Most of her constellation doesn't really matter, and given that she is given for free, I believe, to everyone, so like, it's not a very desirable character for most people. But for beginners, I think getting more constellations to amplify your healing will help you survive quite a bit. And of course, the third character, we do have Ororon, and since he is the newest 4-star addition to the team, the things that I'm about to say are all secondhand information based on all the other theory crafters I've watched like Zajeff, Jay Stern, Flip, and a few others like the Genshin scientists, etc. So for the information that I've collected, Ororon is going to be inferior to Fischl in terms of single target, but in multi-target situations, specifically in an electro-charge team to trigger one of his passive, he is actually going to be better in that regard. From what I can remember, his kit, most of the damage is going to come from his passive. Essentially, imagine Fischl, but rather than coming from something like Oz, which is tied to an ability, it requires you to just trigger like Hydro Electro to trigger the passive, which strikes down every now and again. But I am excited to try to build him when he comes out, and we'll see how that goes. Now, for the weapon banner, I guess we can talk about the first grade magic. So the first grade magic is essentially Lyney's bow. It has high base attack with very high crit damage. It buffs the damage dealt by charge attacks, and for every party member with a similar elemental type with the wielder, including the wielder themselves, they gain a stack. And if they have more characters of the similar element, they will have their attack buff up to 48% at R1. And the more characters they have different, they'll increase the movement speed by a very minimal amount. This is very much a mono elemental bow. Of course, it is made for a Lyney mono pyro team. It is usable on a lot of other units purely for the stat stick, but the movement speed is not generally useful unless you run something like maybe Ganyu Melt. I don't have this bow myself, so I can assume that maybe the 10% movement speed increase might help her dodge a few hits while using a charge attack, but I can't say anything about that regard. But I have also heard that FGM is also Ganyu's best in slot weapon if you were to run a freeze team, so that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, for Chasca's bow, the Astral Vulture's Crimson Plumage, it is going to be her best in slot in any of her teams, so let's go over what the abilities do. So for 12 seconds after triggering a swirl, the attack is buffed by 24%, and when one or two more characters of the party are of different elemental type from the character, the wielder's charge attack will be increased by a certain amount, like 20 to 48%, and the elemental damage burst dealt is increased by this amount. And it seems like this bow wants you to have at least two elements that are different from the character, which means you don't really need the EHEC elements to be there, but ideally this is definitely something you want to consider for all of Chasca's best team. And if I were to think about how good this bow is on other characters, probably just Faruzan, because you need a bow user that is also a Nemo, and as far as I know, I don't think there are any other Nemo bow users aside from Chasca and Faruzan, so it's a very niche weapon. Maybe Faruzan mains would definitely enjoy this by a little bit, but it's Chasca's best in slot weapon, and I don't think that's going to change. And for the other weapon, we also have Chasca's supposed 4-star Gacha bow. So the Flower Reef Feathers, it increases charge attack damage. It has low base attack with high attack percent. Decreases gliding stamina consumption by 15%. When using aim shots, the damage dealt by charge attacks will be increased by 6% every 0.5 seconds, stacked up to 6 times. Remove 10 seconds after leaving aiming mode. So I think this is a maximum of 36% charge attack damage bonus, which is actually quite decent because when you compare to a lot of Chasca's other option, like Song of Stillness is like 32% at R5 at level 90. Hamayumi, I believe, is 24% without burst and then 48% with burst. So this is actually quite comparable to a lot of her other 4-star options. I think with higher refinements, the effect can probably reach up to double or at least 50% more, so this might actually be her best in slot 4-star weapon if you can get it in higher refinement. In terms of other characters that can use this, maybe Ganyu can take advantage of this because it does buff charge attack, like maybe Ganyu and I think Tenari and maybe Lyney, because we do have a few charge attack bow units, so that's something to consider. And of course, the final new weapon for the gacha is the Wave Riding Whirl. Very high ER substat, very low base attack. Decreases swimming stamina consumption by 15%. For 10 seconds after using a skill, you get a HP buff up to 20%. And for every hydro elemental type in the team, max HP is increased by 12% and the maximum increase is 24. Which means if you run double hydro, you can actually maximize this passive. Now, given that this is basically a HP scaling catalyst, this is probably another option for the likes of both Molani and Neuvillette. It's very likely her F2P option because the color design is very much in line with Molani's tribe. Now, obviously between Neuvillette and Molani, they don't really need the ER, the base attack is very much unimportant, but the swimming stamina consumption would be good for exploration, while the max HP buff can reach up to a maximum of I think 44%, and it can be triggered every 15 seconds. Yeah, this is definitely something that can be used by both of them. I'm interested to see how strong this is. I will do a few multis on the weapon banner and maybe try to level it up, but it will definitely be an option for those two units. And of course, the last few weapons, we do have the Flute, the Favonius Lance, and the Bell. And the Flute, I don't really need to say much about it. It's really bad. The passive just adds like some flat attack stuff. I think this is like a cope option that Toyo keeps putting as a trial weapon for every Ayato trial. But regardless, you're gonna have way better options out there outside of the Flute. So it's nothing more than just weapon EXP fodder. And of course, the Favonius Lance is easily one of the best weapons in the game for 4-star because the entire family is a support weapon family and the ability to generate elemental particles for the entire team is extremely valuable on top of the high base attack and the ER substat that the entire family comes with. And if you see at my account right now, I do have 2 Refinement 5 Favonius Lance with 1 R2 and 1 R1. I personally would like to have maybe at least 10 or 20 more copies so I can have 4 to 5 Favonius Lance because there are a lot of characters that can benefit out of it. So if you were to sort by all polearm characters, I believe Kachina can definitely use it by quite a bit. Kachina, Chevreau, Mika, Yao Yao, Candice, Shenhe, Yunjin, Terma. Basically, yeah, even Rosaria, I think, and even Shengling. And Zhongli if you're running a shield bot. So basically, every polearm support character will 1 Fav, and based on the number that I've counted, I don't think any of us will have enough Favonius weapons for them. In the last weapon, we do have the Bell. This weapon is essentially worthless. While the low base attack is not really favorable for anyone, the HP percent could be useful for someone like Dori who actually scales off HP. The passive doesn't really do anything. Essentially, whenever you take damage, you get a shield that absorbs a portion of your max HP, but the cooldown is immensely long, and when protected by a shield, the character gains like 24% increased damage. And I think this weapon is too niche for its own good. Unless we get a HP scaling Claymore character, and the cooldown is reduced to like once every 15 seconds, I think this weapon is basically fodder similar to the Flute. I think the current banner is okay. Ororon is definitely going to be a character that is wanted by a lot of people, especially Chasca wanters, because one of Chasca's best teams supposedly is actually with Ororon. Sucrose, if you do want to get at least Constellation 1 Sucrose, or you finally want to get C6 Sucrose so that you can farm Star Glitter afterwards, you can definitely work towards that. And if you don't have Sucrose and you don't have Kazuha, she's going to be the character that is going to help you if your team's comprised of the PHEC elements. Barbara is a free unit, so it's just a Star Glitter bot. You can use her for Nilo Bloom, but once you do get better options with more characters, she can easily be casted aside onto the shelves. The same could be said for putting her as a healer in Furina teams, because once you get her sister Jean or Shen Yun, or a lot of the other healers out there like maybe Mika and Charlotte, she is easily going to be shelved unless you're going to use her in very specific teams that involve Furina and also require double Hydro. The weapon banner I think is okay. I think the FGM is a bit too niche for mono elemental things, and Chasca's bow is only really good on her and usable on Faruzan, but the 4 stars are actually quite interesting. The Catalyst is going to be good for Molani and Neuvillette. The bow, of course, is going to be good on quite a few charge attack bow DPS, including Chasca herself, and of course Fav. I think these banners are okay. Not the best, not the worst, but there's at least something to be gained one way or another. Otherwise, that's it for the banner review. Hope this helps you guys in making your decision on whether you should pull on the banners or not. I think that's it for the video, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace!